be seated.
Good morning. Please hold your finger at Jonah 4 as you, if you will, turn with me to Numbers chapter 11 as we look at the subject this morning. We can call it Hope Part 2 because I think it was May of last year I preached a sermon on hope after getting to meet with a number of preachers who got a chance to be, seminared or schooled up by a local psychologist who works in one of the local hospitals on the suicide rates here in the area. Why suicide is probably a more surprising, or it's more of an issue here than you might otherwise think. And so back then we talked about from the perspective of Ecclesiastes how Solomon had some things, as wise as he was and as rich as he was, that could probably help us understand some things about hope from a practical perspective that can get you through those down times. Well, we are now in the book of Jonah. And as you saw the scripture reading, talked about at the end of all of Jonah's troubles, being vomited up out of the belly of the fish, on to a mission he didn't want to go on, to preach to the Ninevites, because most preachers want folks to listen. He didn't want them to listen, though, because he wanted God's judgment. And so as he is pulling up to see God's mercy, he is blessed by God to have a plant provide him some shade and some refuge from the heat. And so as we do, I try to pick the happy verses. And so we stopped at a place where Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant that he... Did you keep reading, though? If you know, yeah, right. The same God who sent him a plant sent a worm to destroy the plant. And just as he sent the worm to destroy the plant, it could have been a nice average day. He sent him some extra heat to get Jonah's attention. And if you've lived very long, Murphy's Law, sometimes we say it from time to time. Seems like Jonah was living through a little bit worse than that. Because we said sometimes in Job's circumstance, it seems like God's the one doing this to me when it's really the enemy. With Jonah, no, it really was God. And so where do you go in situations where it really is God putting you in situations that seem to be pushing you past your limit? And Jonah is one of a number of men who served God but asked God for a way out. Specifically asking God 3 times in chapter 4. By the time we get there, God, it is enough. Please let me die. And in that context, we want to look at the life of really 3 other men who have either asked to die or found themselves in life or in ministry wanting a way out in a situation that seemed pretty much hopeless. Starting with Moses, though, in chapter 11 of the book of Numbers. Talked about the life of Moses from time to time, and in the first 9 verses of chapter 11, we are going to see, as we have talked about from time to time, there are healthy ways to get our needs met, and there are unhealthy ways to get our needs met, and we have to understand that getting our needs met has a response or repercussion on the lives and the well-being of the people around us. To the degree that I have found healthy ways to get my needs met, more power to me. I can be a blessing to those around me. But in this period of Israel, the people of Israel, as they were leaving Egypt, had gotten in the habit of complaining to get their way, and it was taking its toll on Moses, and that is the context for verse 10, where I'd like to begin. I think that's a little bit before the verses I gave Brother Eric. But let's begin in verse 10, where it reads, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people, that I give them birth, that you should say to me, Carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child, to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all this people? For they weep before me and say, Give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I have found favor in your sight, that I might not see my wickedness. Understand, Moses got to a point where he thinks the favor of God is basically, please just kill me. And understand, if you have never been to that point, there are people who would feel like it would be a blessing if God just gave me a way out of this suffering. Understand, it's not unlike the times that Jesus prophesied when he said during the end times, people will chase death but not find it as portions of those revelations begin to unfold. And so understand, this is not just a thing that special servants of God go through at certain points. Understanding that we talked about the revelation being a type of conclusion that God brings to periods of history throughout time. As he brought the Greeks to an end at a certain period of time, the Babylonians and the Israelites, there are certain things that societies began to see towards the ends of their declines that you can expect to see during the periods of ups and downs in just about every society. So don't be surprised if we come to a time, even in America, where things become so distressing that more and more people are experiencing exactly the thing that psychologist was telling us about roughly 7 or 8 months ago, where more and more people simply want a way out in consideration of the alternative, which is going another day under the burdens they have. And one of the things we'll see in all of these men is on a normal day, you might be in a situation where people complaining might not bother you much. You might be in a position where, can I break out the tiny violin for you? Is there something I can do to file your complaint in the complaint department? We have a trash can over here? Exactly. That's what some people will tell you would be the complaint department when they're in their right situation, in a good mood, on a good day. But there are times in life where the context of the complaint will find you in a space where it's just enough to push you over the edge. And that is where we find Moses in this situation. But understand this. One of the reasons why we say it is so important, God willing, to live your life in a place where you are close to God is understand it is not only Moses' tank that was full. Turn back with me real quick. What does it say? Chapter 11, verse 10. The anger of the Lord blazed hotly. And that matters. Because there are times when I'm being pushed past my end where one of the consistent things we are going to see with each of these men that we look at, whether it's Paul, so we have Paul at the end, whether it is Moses or Elijah or Jonah or Paul, is God is going to give them something, sometimes in ways they can clearly see, but in other ways it's going to require them to go an extra step to ask God for, as we say from time to time, an extra degree of wisdom and insight to see hope in otherwise hopeless spaces. Because what's Moses' situation or resolution here? Well, before God gets into a position where he's going to step in and actually deal with the situation that is causing Moses grief, he's going to give him some very practical help, beginning in verse 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and the officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand before me. And I will come down and talk with you there. And I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it alone." One of the things that it helps for you to ask for God in those moments when you seem like you are in despair. Sometimes it's not like God saying, "Oh no, you're not alone, Moses." When we get to Elijah, he's going to be like, "There are still so many thousand people who have not bowed the knee to Baal." No, he's really going to say, "You are alone." Even though you got Aaron. Aaron's been pretty reliable. He's your brother. Certain places you're going to read, he really did love Aaron, even though Aaron had his flaws. But God is acknowledging that he's really in his right to feel alone in this circumstance. But understand, in a situation, whether it is your workplace, your family, your friend group, where you feel like you are absolutely alone, God can help you see people who may not be perfectly positioned to rally around you in a time you need it, but they may be closer to being a part of your solution than you realize. And at that point where you are ready to give up, you may not see perfect assistance in the crowd that might just seem like it's just set against you. But if you just ask for God to maybe give me a little bit more insight. I was going to try to save this illustration for later, but one of the ties that seem to tie this whole thing together is from time to time, Brother talked about being back in Pullman. I use the illustration of MacGyver back in Pullman every now and again. MacGyver was that show back in the day that had a recent reboot. This guy could be locked in a jail cell with a paper clip and some bubble gum. And if they left him a bubble gum wrapper and some paper clip, they left him too much. Because he could find his way out of that prison cell with that paper clip, that bubble gum wrapper, and a whole lot of ingenuity. understand that prison cell for MacGyver is in a lot of ways the walls of despair and depression and hopelessness that can build up around us. See, I can't tell the world how to deal with hopelessness and despair. But one of the things I can say to you is if you are a believer, one of the advantages you have is a God that can help you see beyond your circumstances in ways you haven't to this point. I'm just going to tell TMI, but as I was studying Jonah this week, my laptop absolutely, it's still, they're talking the blue screen of death. This week, I think it was Thursday, right? Except on the Mac, it's black, right? It don't cut on. Did I have the study guide done yet? Do I usually do it on the regular computer? Does it look like it's good to do on a phone? No, it's not fun to do on a phone. And it's still not working. Then after that, what happened? Just that morning, I get down in the car. Oh yeah, I'm locking my car up because I don't have an automatic starter. And I break the key off when I'm using the key to lock the, right? So that's the morning. And so then I go get the backup key. And I'm coming to work, and why is the car still beeping? It started, just leave me alone, stop beeping. Well, by the time I get here and cut the car off, I realize that the batteries died on the backup key. Right? And so I cleaned out the glove compartment of my backup battery, and so the backup battery's at home. It's raining a little. I think it was raining a little bit. It was a nice walk. Right? But I get back, and I'm apologizing to Jennifer sitting behind me because she's starting to cough. I was like, are you coughing? Are you sick? Because I got sick from the walk. Right? And it keeps piling on one. I wasn't going to tell the story because I'm just like, whatever, it's my problems. But those are the things, sometimes it just piles on like that. And I can laugh about it because it wasn't that bad. But ultimately, you worry about the way it affects people around. You see Mom masked up today, right? I'm at a house with Mom. She's stuck with a sick guy all weekend, right? So I got other people to worry about. And so there are times in life where it just piles up one after another. And eventually I began, oh, wait a minute. I'm looking at the book of Jonah. Maybe there's a living illustration in that. As it's not just Murphy's Law, but it seems like the events are actually stacked up against me. And so one of the reasons why I'm saying maybe pray for extra insight is because I'm laughing now, but I wasn't laughing here. If you would have come through, I've had to apologize to people before when they came up in the building and I was talking to myself in some words. I was like, I apologize if you heard anything that didn't sound preacher-like, because I don't always. Pray for me, please. Sean, double, please pray for me extra. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm not proud of it, but there are times when life squeezes out of me some of those things that are left in there that I need God to completely clean out. And God willing, they're a little bit more clean now, today, than they were on Friday, than they were on those days before, when you might have heard if Renee might have snuck up on me at the wrong time this week. She might have, Renee, I'm sorry. And so that's what Jonah seems to be going through, right? Those moments when life is squeezing the rest of what needs to be pushed out of you. That's what he's dealing with. And Moses is dealing with it as well. And the beautiful thing about what God does for Moses is he helps him see that in that situation where it seems like life is arrayed against you, just let God MacGyver that situation for you. That situation that seems like it's walled in on every side. He can help you see why people watch shows like MacGyver. Because if everybody could get out of that cell, nobody cares. Who cares? Watch something else. But people care because those are difficult situations to get out of. And so insofar as you actually believe in there being a God, let him help you see broader or bigger than your problems. Because that's half of the advantage of saying we believe in God. There's some practical advantages to dealing with despair under his care as we go forward, to 1 Kings chapter 19. We see how Elijah dealt with a different perspective of the same thing. After he had a great victory on Mount Carmel over the false prophets of Baal, Elijah's going to get something that we get a chance to see something we saw in the life of David, and that's winning does not always look like what we think winning should look like. It's a familiar theme, but let's look at it from this perspective of Jonah problems. Where in verse 1 it's going to say, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This is another great man of God. By the time you get to the New Testament, it's one thing if I pat myself on the back, but Jesus himself is going to say, amongst those born of women, there's none greater than John the Baptist. And if you're willing to hear it, he's basically Elijah. And so when you reach those moments of despair, don't necessarily consider it a moment of or a sign of weakness, that you want out of the struggles that you have, because God has dragged his servants through some of the struggles that most of us would consider unbearable. By the time we get to Jonah, there are going to be some low-key signs in Jonah that I've probably already tipped off in the short lessons, that Jonah, as much as we might look at him for him wanting to find joy in the destruction of the Ninevites, it seems like Jonah might have been through some things before he ended up in the belly of that fish. And so likewise, there are times when the weight on you makes wanting to die a reasonable response. And even if it's not reasonable, it's no worse than some of God's best. Among his servants, you're not going to find any better than Moses and Elijah. And now we've got a common denominator between the two of them. The burden got so heavy, they ain't want no more. In my best southern dialect, right? So understand, in this situation, it's important to understand, as we said in the life of David, to understand what winning really looks like. There are times in my life where, understand, Elijah was one of those prophets who, by the time we get to the whole passing of the baton thing, God's going to give him Hazael to anoint as king over Syria, and he's going to give him Jehu to anoint as king over Israel, and he's going to give him Elisha to anoint as prophet in his place. Elisha's going to be one of them killing prophets, but Elijah was one of those running prophets. He had spent so much time running for his life that it probably seemed like he had finally, reached the peak of the mountaintop, crossed the threshold. He was finally done with all his running. At the point he got a chance to get that great victory at Mount Carmel. But just about as soon as he got through winning, he had to get back to running. And that's the reality of winning in life, especially when you're winning big victories. See, it's one thing to win a small victory, but he won a victory that embarrassed a really important person in Israel, Jezebel. And sometimes the greater the victory you win, the more public the victory you win. That's why a lot of times you see a lot of these servants of God, they want to find low-key spaces. I don't need a whole lot of publicity. That's why I don't like to tell a whole lot of my stories, as many of them as I tell. But sometimes, anytime you're doing really well, I say it in life sometimes, I like to sometimes just pretend like, I'm just doing okay, when things are actually going pretty well. Because I don't want to ring that dinner bell for Satan. To be like, well, if things are going so well for him, maybe I haven't been working hard enough, right? Go somewhere else. But there's sometimes when you just can't hide it. The mission and the assignment that God has for you, it's going to involve a win. But just understand, Paul says, run with endurance the race that's set before you for a reason. Because just because God gave you a victory does not mean that the war is over. We are literally described as being in spiritual warfare, right? And so sometimes I will take my victories in battle and I will equate that to being, okay, now they don't want to come back here anymore. They saw what happened right there. No! They're going to double their reinforcements, they're going to bring even more, and they're going to prove that whatever you thought you just proved was just a blip on the radar. We talked about trending, right? You can have momentary success in one of those stock graphs, but don't make too much of a momentary bump or a momentary dip, because you got to understand whether that thing's trending up or trending down. And understand here with Elijah, part of his distress and despair comes in the fact that he didn't realize that the victory on Mount Carmel was just a bump in a trend that still wasn't ready to really recover. And so he still was in a downward trend because Jezebel wasn't through. What God was about to help him see from the cave was it's not going to be in your ministry to conquer what's going on in Israel right now. That's for Hazael. That's for Jehu. That's for your replacement Elisha. I just need you to run a little bit longer without expecting the kind of victory that you might have thought was coming on Mount Carmel, because that's just a step. This thing has some more bottoming out that it needs to do. And so with us, it's the same thing. We talk about a lot of our happiness or lack thereof has to do with the expectations that we set in life. God, please help us on the front end of a victory to help us understand where that victory or that loss really fits in the greater path or pattern of where the war is right now for me in my life. So I'm not too elated by victories, but likewise, in times when I'm defeated, because Moses was defeated, I'm not making too much of what seems like it might be checkmate in life. When God's saying, one, you don't play chess all that good, Marcus, right? And then two, just take the little assignment that I've given you, and I'll help you see the next move to realize, once again, MacGyver, it's not checkmate. It's not checkmate, even if it looks like it. As we move forward, let's flip to the life of Paul. Let's look to the life of Paul before we finally settle in Jonah and see that in 1 Corinthians, Paul had something similar go on in his own ministry, but it starts out with words of comfort, oddly enough, as in verse 3 of 2 Corinthians, chapter 1. Verse 3 of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it's going to be a relatively famous passage. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you also share in our comfort. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessings granted us through the prayers of many." The part I wanted to focus on, of course, was that part in verses 8 and 9 where he says, we were burdened beyond our strength, that we despaired of life. In verse 9 going on to say that we felt like we had the sentence of death. But the purpose statement is where I think we draw from in this particular passage. But that was to make us rely on not ourselves, but from God. But really what it really ties back to is earlier on in verse 4 where it says he's praying for comfort. But the thing that he is allowing to comfort them is the fact that, verse 4, the God who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. In a lot of ways, this is just a point for review. But the thing that seems to tie it together in Paul's ministry is something that's going to help us, I think, understand the context of Jonah. Not so much when he's in the belly of the fish, but Jonah when he is in the ship, running to Tarshish when the assignment is in Nineveh. Paul seems to understand that, as we have mentioned before, my despair seems to grow greater the more narrowly I'm focused on my personal ambitions. Paul realizes that he is suffering so that he can be able to encourage those he hadn't necessarily even met yet. His sufferings didn't start when he met the Corinthians. He had a lifetime of suffering that built up to the point where he could write this letter. And so by the time he is writing the letter, he has already endured a lifetime of sufferings, plus that they can understand, because as he's referring to, these are things you already know about my ministry and understand in your life. When you meet people, they're going to have a certain shared suffering with you, that whether or not they've gone through it with you or not, they know about what you have suffered. Story I just told from my life from last week, an example, right? But then there's all the other that goes into building up how I respond to my late last week. Computer dying, car key thing, sickness, all that kind of stuff. And so likewise in your life. There are times when you may despair of the accumulation because the context of what you've gotten to that point to what's brought you to that point might make you like Moses. It might just be a little bit of complaining that sends you over the edge. It might be like Elijah. When you're winning, seems like it should have been a finish line, but you realize, like we said from that Navy SEAL 40% principle, when you realize that you feel as though you're at your maxed out capacity, your body, God willing, is really just at 40%. Understand, that's what was seemingly going on with Elijah as God gave him a little bit of food and told him to carry on a little bit more. Paul, we see, has a lot of the advantages that we do. He has the benefit of studying the life of a Moses. He has the benefit of studying the life of an Elijah. And he realizes that one day somebody's going to be studying his life too. And the more I realize that, God willing, I have the ability to study a Paul in addition to all those other folks, but right now somebody is studying my life too, God willing, I will not be as distressed when I come into conflicts or situations or downtimes in my life when it seems like life is just stacked up against me. But I'm realizing it is not about me having a good day as much as it is about me having a better ability to counsel, to, God willing, offer a listening ear, realizing that there's some times when I'm going to hear somebody's struggles and I'm going to be like, I don't have a struggle that matches that one, bud. But one of the things I can do is realize that if that's outside of my scope, I can listen, and I can listen with some compassion. Because one of the things I do sometimes is I'll listen, but I'll listen with one of these. I'll be, check my clock. No, I'm supposed to be listening, but I can't. One of the things that suffering does for me is it deepens my ability to listen with some compassion in situations where I won't naturally be feeling it. And one of the things is it's even a different level. When I want to feel it, I want to be compassionate, but I just don't have the depth of life experience to really feel it. People can see that too, right? People can see when you're trying to empathize as opposed to when you can really, even if you don't know everything they're going through, you really have a concern for what they're actually going through. And that's one of the things you can't fake. That's one of the things that going through suffering makes natural. It's like we talk about. One of the things about heaven is right now, people catch me out in the streets. They say hi, I'll say hi. Sometimes I'm trying to be happy. I was saying hi to people as I was walking back to the church. I was waving to cars. You think I was real happy? I was trying to be happy. Right? But that's the whole thing about heaven. You ain't got to try to be happy no more. It's just like you go to sleep. You got to try to breathe. You got to try to beat your heart. God willing, God is getting us ready for a place where the joy is just, as we say from time to time, it's just as involuntary as our bodily functions of breathing, respiration, and having our heart beat, right? And so God willing, we start to look at our difficulties in life from that perspective. It's more and more effortless for us to be able to relate to people who are going through struggles that we would not be able to genuinely, naturally relate to without struggles of our own. And please let that be the context for Jonah as we finally turn to the book of Jonah and God willing close up. And I don't know why this keeps catching me off guard every time I go through Jonah, but one of our sisters was like, Jonah's my favorite book. And I was like, why? So, might not have said, it might be a misquote, might not be favorite, but it's a story she enjoyed quite a bit. And as a preacher, it's not one I enjoy all that much. Like I told you last week, preachers, we got our favorite verses, and so I started with the favorite verse last week. This isn't one I don't read Jonah all that much, but when I do, this is a part I forget every time. Every time, beginning in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was on the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. How do I keep forgetting that part? It literally connects to the life of Jesus. Right? And so how do I forget of all parts? I forget it every time. It's like I read it for the first time, this time, all over again. And understand the way it hit me this time was, understand there are times in life where these are, like, I've heard people preach before, Jesus was calm in a situation where the mighty seamen, the people experienced them being storms, they were afraid. Jonah too. It didn't say Jonah was a sailor. There are going to be times in your life when you have had enough. So much so that the normal things that will destabilize the peace, tranquility, and stability of everybody else around you, it's not that you're just that tough. You just don't have a whole lot more emotion to give to that situation. And so as we look to chapter 4, fast forward with me, please. Chapter 4, verse 1. After the conclusion of chapter 3, where it's going to say in verse 10, when God saw what they did in repenting, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he said he would do to them. And he did not do it. Chapter 4, verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry, and he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster." What's he doing right there? What's he doing there? I can't say, but he's buttering them up, it sounds like, right? All these compliments and praise, right? So when I get in a tight situation, I sometimes heap on the praise. And I don't consider myself to be much of a flatterer, but when I want something, God will bring us all to a place where we'll start the flattering. But look at what Jonah's going to ask for. What's he buttering up God for? Verse 3. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Can you imagine it getting so bad that you're not just asking God to take you out, you're trying to butter him up to get it done? It's one of the reasons why I say no matter how bad I've had it, I can't relate to everybody's struggles, but I can relate to that. I can't offer him any words of advice and counsel, but I can say, brother, as bad as I've had it, you won. You won. But praise God for unanswered prayers, right? Because understand that the same guy who is begging for God, this isn't the last time, right after the reading that we had, he was exceedingly glad because God gave him a little bit of a break. See, it seems real nice because in verse 5, Jonah went out of the city, and this is the reading, and sat to the east of the city to make a booth for himself there. And he sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God had appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad. Praise God. I've had a relief from all my trials. Sister back here smiling, right? Keep reading, right? I mean, this is one where it's literally God who's doing this because the story's going to go on to say verse 7. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint, and he asked that he might die, saying, it's better for me to die than to live. He's not even in a situation. You remember the Job situation where Mrs. Job was like, just curse God and die. No matter what kind of knocks we might have on Jonah, he's not pushed to a place. I get mad at God sometimes. I'm not going to say I've cursed God, but I can appreciate the struggle of people who are pushed to the point because they've grown up godless. I grew up with God, so I understand the fear of God. And I get pushed to a point where I get super frustrated. So I have a hard time judging people who, as much as my first reaction might be, when I see people who grew up without the church in their life, they grew up with a completely different perspective on what life is and what it should have for them. When they say some things that sound really harsh about God, I have to catch myself. Because as Mama used to say, there but by the grace of God go I. Because even as much Jesus as I've had in my life, I can still be a little bit testy in my prayers, right? My approach and my attitude to God sometimes. So how can I expect more out of people who didn't grow up in church? And so understand, as we are growing in a time where Jesus' words still ring true, there are times when he's going to say the prostitutes and the tax collectors will enter the kingdom before some of his people. Why? Because the good news about all these hard times good news is that they're bringing people into a place where they are looking for something more than whatever it is they've already gotten themselves into. I'm going to steal from Sister Linda again. The question that she posed, she said, coming out of the New Age movement, one of the questions that she began to pose to friends was, so how do you like the world that you have created for yourself? Did I say that right, sister? Close. How do you like the reality that you created for yourself? And that's the flip side of a godless life, is even with God, my temptation is to take the credit for all the good of my life, my choices, but to have a real short memory for the fact that my choices also breed some consequences that I might not like so much. And so as much as I want to take credit for all the good things I think I've thought up in my life, I always want to shift. There's times when I'm tempted to get angry at God. There's scripture that literally says, when a man's ways, or when a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. It's Bible. I don't know if it's Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. And so there are times when I have invested heavily in doing things my own way. And while it's going good, I'm that guy. Can't tell me nothing. But once it starts to turn bad, then Miss Linda's words of wisdom come to mind. And that is one of the things that we are seeing now when we're talking about evangelism in an age where people who were once godless are now looking for something. Maybe don't hold it against them so much when they have harsh words for God. If it's attached to a heart that still appreciates things like truth and integrity and love. Why? Because one of those things I realized, give credit every now and again, it's time for me to sit down, but my very first preaching instructor started us off. All of our preaching instructors at this one school started us off in what I consider to be odd places for a Bible school. But he started us off in a preaching class by helping us think about what is it that you want. Similar to what I said one of my preaching mentors was helping me think about as he was signing his book on preaching for me. He said, what do you want to hear? And understand that when you're talking to people, that's the first question you really need to answer. Because what they want to hear, in the illustration I've used before, is going to have a lot to do with what they are willing to hear. And you might have all the right answers, but if that's a mismatch with where they are right now, then you're basically wasting your words. And one of the things that tends to open people's hearts, if they're actually receptive, some people, it's like the four soils. No matter what you say, it's going to be on that tightly packed soil around the path. It's not going to penetrate. Others are going to be so receptive for a relief from the struggle that they're going through that they are going to accept what you have to say quickly, but they're not going to really care about the truth any more than they care about just getting relief from their current situation. Other people, like the thorny soil, are going to care about truth, but over the long haul of life, endurance is not going to allow that word to really take root and produce anything effective. God willing, we are looking at times in life where right now we're finding people who are more akin to that fertile soil. No matter what their history might have been of openly rebuking God or being angry at God, maybe life's difficulties are bringing them to a place where the more and more isolation we see in the world, the fewer friends they have. Because if you live for very long, you realize friendships are cool when they're going well, but they don't last very long, right? And the best friendships go through some ups and some downs. And if you haven't endured some times with your friends where there's just some times you didn't want to talk very much right now, then I will challenge you to reevaluate how deep that friendship really is. And understand now, we're in a situation where, I talk about it from time to time, people are having a hard time finding any friends whatsoever. And I was talking to a brother who went out of his way to try to teach a brother that we had referred to us from a radio commentator down south. They have somebody who's living not too far from us right here, and they've reached an impasse in what they're able to agree on, because he comes from a background where there's just some doctrinal principles he's not willing to let go of. And one of the things it reminded me of was times in my life when I reached the same impasse with other people. And the one thing that I was able to do, God willing, is to maintain the friendship, to maintain a relationship that helped them to understand that even though we disagree on this issue perceptually, when you need to call me, even if you know I'm, like I say, nerd hermit, you know that when you call me, I will actually be there. Even if we don't see each other all the time, God willing, you've got friends that you can call back or more importantly, you are that friend that people can call on. You might not have talked to them in years. You might have been through some bumpy spots where you all don't like to talk to each other all the time. But at the end of the day, you can pick up the phone and you know that there's just a certain level of mutual respect that says, this is a person I can call. The more times you fill out that role in people's lives right now, the more I think you will be able to find people who one day, as life continues to bring them through their Moses and Elijah and Paul and Jonah moments, you will find people who you will be surprised might pick up the phone one day and actually want to hear about God. I say that because over my years, I'm not going to say too much because sometimes they might tune in and press play on one of these lessons. But I was on the phone with a young person I've known since they were born, basically. And a close friend of mine whose dad, his uncle actually was a preacher. But because he got to see the difference between the way that preacher lived and the way he preached, he didn't want to have anything to do with church. And I've told some of y'all this story before. Well, I was super close friends with both of them as a couple. They ended up splitting, but stayed in touch with both of them because I was, just close with the family. And eventually, as that young lady moved on, never talked to either of them about God much after I knew what my buddy's experience was. I kind of nervously and unconfidently brought up God. And I was like, I don't know if you believe in God, but I'm going to pray for you because it seems like things are going well now, and I want them to keep going that way. She said, Marcus, we found a church here, and we really, really enjoy it. And ultimately what happened was that family that I was scared to mention Jesus to, just because of the fact that we didn't necessarily keep close contact over the years. But we realized that at the end of the day, I'm not a Christian, but if you need something, you can call me. And likewise, I can't completely understand why you throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely get rid of God just because you don't like what your uncle did. At the end of the day, we've reached the point where that family sought God without my quote-unquote intervention. And so without all that, reached one of those points where I just need to get back to the Word, and hopefully that'll help wrap the point up as we look at the third time where Jonah is going to ask God to basically kill him. Where he says in verse 9, God is going to ask him the question, but God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished. And in a night perished. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? And that is where the story ends. See, unlike Elijah, Moses, or Paul, we do not get to see where it goes from here for Jonah. We just get to see him left with God's answers. But understand that one of those MacGyver points is this, is we don't know whether or not Jonah gets the point that God is trying to make to him. But one of the things that we said, or either we're going to say in the short lesson that comes out as we end up the book of Jonah in the short lessons, is it's so important to understand that in times when I want to pray condemnation on a situation where I feel fully vindicated, I need to understand not only the mind of Jonah that God is getting him into, but how that points back to the mind of Moses. Understand how all of these men, in their deepest moments, or moments that are pushing them to the point where they want to die, they're not praying for God to lash out against those who wronged them. They're saying, God, fix me. And it might not sound like they're saying, fix me, because they're simply saying, I want to die. But one of the things they remind me of is a man who I knew who was a preacher who had actually mentored me for years. And I saw he was in a situation where his marriage, it wasn't, preachers are people, right? And his marriage wasn't in the happiest of situations. They stayed together because they were committed. But he got into the habit where, and it's like not always one, sometimes it's a situation where one party's more at fault. Sometimes it's just each party is, I don't know about anybody's marriage because I'm a single guy talking about marriage. But there were some things we could see that made him have a legitimate reason to be in despair. And one of the things he said is, Marcus, don't worry about my business. Just pray to God that he fix me. And that spoke volumes to me. Because from what I could see in the shared suffering that I had with this family, this man had plenty of reasons to complain, to drag his family out into a public space. Because I've seen situations where preachers will preach. I preached way too many personal stories. I've seen situations where I've seen preachers give into the temptation to throw their family under the bus, and this man wasn't doing that. Understand that he was doing something that I now see being in the pattern of men like I said, Moses, who, if you look at the rest of that story, after he's given elders to help him out, God steps in to intervene on Moses' behalf. Moses said, God, take me. Elijah said, God, take me. Jonah said, God, take me. And so when we're looking at situations in life where it's gotten to be too heavy, they point forward to one more example of one who's not necessarily a man, but Michael, the archangel. We've talked about before, when we look at that passage in Revelation 12, where it's talking about the war in heaven, where Satan was actually put out of heaven. It wasn't God who did it. It wasn't the Christ who put him out of heaven. It was Michael. But if you turn to a relatively obscure book in the Bible, the book of Jude, when he was contending with the devil himself for the body of Moses, Michael, the man who presumably had already put Satan out of heaven, basically said a simple prayer: the Lord rebuke you. Understand, let me have gotten into a situation where I'd been in some conflict. My male energy might have gotten to the point where we've already done this before. I might have been tempted to talk some noise. But the wisdom of a Michael, the wisdom of Moses, the wisdom of Jonah is to understand that the battle really belongs to the Lord. And so understand that one of the ways that we get into the hopeless situations, one of the ways to really ruin it, as I say from time to time, is to allow life to draw me into the conflict, to draw me into the struggle, to make it a back and forth, so that when God would step in, he has to both discipline me and the situation that I'm dealing with. But the wisdom of a Michael, the wisdom of all these other men that we have studied here, and the wisdom really for us all, going back to the life of and the struggle of Jonah, is basically understanding that beyond Jonah's responsibility to God, Nineveh also bears at least a little bit of a responsibility. And God willing, I can wrap it up in this way. There are times in my life when it's easy for me to look at the story from the perspective of a Jonah, right? I preach. Easy for me to admire those men who take the high road in situations where they could easily point the finger. But there are also times in life when I look at it from not so much the perspective of the preacher, the person who's teaching or trying to take on a position of leadership, but I take it on from the perspective of one who has simply been forgiven. And the reason why the subtitle for the lesson today was going to be 360 is because in life, one of the things that God notices about the Ninevites is that they were willing to turn from the things that they had been doing. But the danger in life is when I have been forgiven is to take a turn that I could describe as a 180-degree turn and turn it back into a 360-degree turn. And so the danger in life is for me to make it tough on men like Jonah, to see that they have already potentially been through a lot of struggle that'll make a shipwreck seem like it's basically nothing, to the point where 3 times they're going to ask God to die in situations where they should be happy. I have a responsibility as the forgiven too, not to allow my turns to become 360-degree turns. And life isn't as simple as 180-degree turns and 360-degree turns. There are a lot of other points on that dial, because it's a circle for a reason. It has a circumference. But God willing, I am in showing my thanks. We had a great lesson from Jake this morning, who basically helped us to understand, look, if we're going to come say thank you to the Christ and thank you for his sacrifice, what are we willing to sacrifice? God willing, one of the things that we're willing to do is to make it easier on those who have been patient with us, who have prayed us through the difficult moments, who could really be encouraged by seeing a lasting change in us, understanding that we're going into tax season now, right? And I remember because we had fire season maybe a year or 2 ago in Washington State where I was doing my taxes, there was an automatic extension on taxes for that year. And so when I'm talking to the tax folks, you got an extension, Marcus. You don't have to worry about being late, even though you're pretty much late every year, right? This year I wasn't late yet. But could you imagine if I took that tax extension and just didn't do taxes at all? That would be a huge mistake. And so understand that's in a lot of ways what's going on with the city of Nineveh here. Because in a few weeks, we're going to get to a prophet by the name of Nahum. And it's not going to be great news for the people of Nineveh. Because by the time we get to the prophet Nahum, it's going to be nothing but the same old thing we've heard with the Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs and the Ezekiels. This time, it's basically they went from 180 to 360. And God willing, even though we have an incomplete on the story of Jonah, we have other nations that, like we see out of Israel, his own people, we have a remnant, God willing, out of Nineveh, who people like Jonah could look to and say, even if the rest of Nineveh is destroyed, my mission there wasn't completely lost because there is a remnant out of Nineveh. And even though I wanted to see everybody destroyed, if I'd have gotten my way, there are these people who are now actually pretty decent people. They're encouraging others, and with their life, I can see fruit in what they're doing. So just like I'm thanking God for an unanswered prayer and taking my life, praise God for the times he lets me live long enough to see that my unanswered prayers for vengeance and retribution and getting even with people who I thought didn't have much value, let me live long enough to see exactly why God was waiting and not answering my prayers for vengeance when that's all I could see in the middle of my anger. And so with that, God willing, appreciate your patience. Where am I at an hour now? What's this, an hour and a half? Bottom line is if we got to, it's a long sermon. We got to sum it up. Praise God for the new year to the degree we have seen the new year. Got to see Brother Bob here not too long ago. And I know how much of a struggle it's been for Brother Bob to overcome a stroke, to do rehabilitation, and actually make it back to church. That's no promise. And so when we look at sermons like this, we can look at people around us and see the way that they have. They're still asking for prayers, as our sister Lynn is asking for prayers for her son. We have evidence of answered prayers in this congregation. And so as we start out a new year, God willing, no matter where it takes you to, if it takes you to some Moses, Elijah, Jonah moments, please look at the people who we have had who have already shown some signs of recovery. And ask God willing, to help open our eyes to the way in which he can help us MacGyver our ways out of some potentially hopeless situations as we together stand and sing.
Take out my life,